Hearing will come to order. The subcommittee meets today to receive testimony on airborne intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance programs contained in the Air Force's fiscal year 2019 budget request. I want to welcome our witnesses today for today's panel. Lieutenant General Jerry Harris, Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Plans and Requirements. Ms. Susan Thornton, a member of the Air Force's Senior Executive Service and Director of Air Force Information Dominance Acquisition Programs. Lieutenant General Anthony Iardi, a Director of Force Structure, Resources, and Assessment for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Lieutenant General John Dolan, Director of Operations for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You all have really long titles. So, we thank all of you for your service and for being with us today. And after reviewing the Air Force's fiscal year 2019 budget request, the subcommittee is somewhat satisfied with its content and funding levels provided for the Airborne ISR enterprise. The budget request appears to support what is needed to sustain the legacy fleet of ISR programs, but the subcommittee is disappointed that there is no significant capacity growth in the Air Force's ISR portfolio to meet more airborne ISR requirements. ISR is the pace setter for operations. In short, ISR is a combat multiplier that not only informs our commanders where they need to engage, but also where not to engage and what areas to avoid. With the exception of full motion video capability provided for counterterrorism support, there appears to be stagnation in the remainder of the ISR portfolio for other critical intelligence needs. This stagnation maintains the ISR capacity shortfall and should be reversed to fill more combatant commanders' intelligence requirements. We understand that we cannot afford to satisfy all combatant commander ISR requirements, but consistently we see year after year ISR fulfillment rates for critical intelligence areas in single-digit percentages, and with higher risk than there should be. It seems that if there's not more effort within all of the services to achieve more SIR capacity for our combat commanders, that we will have a continued shortfall. I am pleased, however, to see that the Air Force has finally removed the uncertainty regarding the high-altitude ISR capability that the U-2 and RQ-4 Global Hawk provide, and that both platforms will be sustained and modernized well into the future. There is one major point of contention in the budget request that we'll need to work through, but I'm confident that we will reach a satisfactory compromise. The Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar System Recapitalization Program, also known as JSTARS RECAP, and the Air Force's decision to terminate this program on essentially the eve of the source selection decision. The Air Force's request to forego JSTARS RECAP program in favor of fielding a concept called Advanced Battle Management System, or ABMS. At the moment, there appears to be multiple disconnects with this concept, and I want to highlight a few that stand out. First and foremost, the new concept appears to contradict the years of extensive analysis and testimony to Congress that underpin the current validated requirements. From as early as December 2011, when the Air Force completed its analysis of alternatives, to as late as August 2016, when the Joint Requirements Oversight Council validated the JSTARS RECAP Capability Development Document, which is the document that justifies how and why a platform is being designed against a validated requirement. All conclusions pointed to a capability consisting of a business jet-sized aircraft with a reduced crew that would provide at the tactical edge of the contested battlefield, onboard, real-time battle management command and control, and moving target indicator intelligence to the warfighter maneuvering on the ground. These years of analysis were molded against anti-access aerial denial threats per the previous administration's defense strategy of 2012. Which identified that states such as China and Iran will continue to pursue asymmetrical means to counter our power projection capabilities, while the proliferation of sophisticated weapons and technology will extend to non-state actors as well. Accordingly, the U.S. military will invest as required to ensure its ability to operate effectively in anti-access area denial environments. There is not enough time to go through all the analysis completed by many entities within the department, but the committee staff provided a comprehensive summary to each member's office outlining specific details. Second, the Air Force plans to rely upon unmanned aircraft capabilities and sensors in Increment 1 of ABMS that the analysis of alternatives has already determined would not meet full spectrum requirements. Further, the Air Force now wants to rely upon the Airborne Warnings and Control Systems, or AWACS, aircraft to do battle management, command, and control for ground forces, in addition to its primary mission of providing battle management, command, and control for airborne forces. all without increasing the crew size or adding additional mission spaces on board the aircraft to effectively perform this mission because the aircraft has no physical growth capacity. Third, ABMS is not forecasted to reach initial operational capability until 2035, which is 11 years after JSTAR's recap would begin fielding. ABMS is not forecasted to reach full operational capacity until 2042, which theoretically is 6 years prior to when JSTAR's recap is scheduled to begin retirement. This schedule, of course, assumes that everything goes as planned and that all technologies and capabilities with the ABMS, many of which are still yet to be developed, are fielded without any issues. Finally, JSTAR's recap aircraft is being designed as a true open architecture, open mission systems capability with a highly advanced 5th-generation radar and robust communication and battle management command and control suite of capabilities. This is a hallmark example of acquisition reform that this committee has been pushing, and it does not make sense why this capability is not being used as the foundation for the ABMS concept. As we move forward in understanding the ABMS concept, we also need to understand where the risks to the warfighter lie and what risk mitigation paths we can take in the near and midterm to ensure that the validated requirements of the ground warfighter are met without question. To put this all in perspective, we understand that the projected threats to our forces are real, and that the Air Force has submitted a budget that does not include JSTAR's recap. However, completely walking away from this program may prove to be an unacceptable level of risk to our warfighters for this committee. As we continue to build the FY19 NDAA, we hope to learn more and look forward to working with the Air Force on a path forward that will both mitigate risks to the warfighter and invest in the new Air Force programs that the Air Force is proposing. I will now turn to my good friend from Massachusetts, Ms. Nikki Songas, for her comments that she might want to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to our witnesses. It's good to have you here. I'd like to thank you for being here today to talk about the several Air Force intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance programs. As the chairman has pointed out, ensuring that the Air Force preserves and expands the support it provides to the joint force in this mission area has been an ongoing concern for the subcommittee for many years. The United States has the world's largest and most advanced airborne reconnaissance fleet. The question for Congress is, in my view, how do we keep it that way and make it even better? This capability does not, of course, come cheap. Continued investment in the platforms, sensors, data networks, and, importantly, the people across the ISR community is required. It is not surprising, then, that the cost of this enterprise creates tension inside the Air Force's budget. And while some trade-offs with other important Air Force missions are appropriate, all too often this mission area appears to be viewed as a bill payer for other Air Force needs. In addition, there is some important recent history with the Congress in this area. Since I joined this committee, the Air Force has proposed retiring the U-2 and Global Hawk fleets. In both cases, Congress blocked these plans based primarily on concerns about overall ISR capacity and constant shortfalls in this mission area. In the end, in both cases, Congress concluded that the Air Force's request to retire these platforms was the result of a narrow, short-term, purely funding-driven view that failed to account for an ever-growing demand for ISR on behalf of our combatant commanders around the world. That is important context for today's hearing. The fiscal year 2019 request for Air Force programs in this area is overall quite well funded. Continued investments in the U-2, RQ-4 Global Hawk, RQ-9 Reaper, RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft, and E-3 Sentry fleets look healthy compared to recent requests. There is also funding for the ground-based side of the ISR enterprise. There is, however, one important exception to this overall positive trend, the proposed termination of the JSTAR's replacement program. As we'll hear more about today, the Air Force plans to cancel the JSTAR's replacement program in order to develop a decentralized network capability that integrates sensors across many platforms. This decision deserves close consideration for several reasons. First, while the Air Force notes its decision is based on new threats, those very same threats were considered in 2011 when the DoD conducted an analysis of alternatives that led to the JSTAR's replacement program. Second, those same threats cited by the Air Force are a danger to any non-stealth aircraft in the early stages of a conflict. Yet the Air Force is not proposing mass retirements of fourth-generation fighters or even other reconnaissance aircraft based on commercial aircraft such as the E-3 AWACS KC-46 tanker, RC-135 rivet joint, or compass call. Third, the Air Force appears to be walking away from the joint in JSTARS. The origin of the original E-8 JSTARS fleet was a desire to integrate with U.S. Army sensors and weapons to attack targets behind enemy lines. The Air Force's proposal to terminate this program sends a message to the U.S. Army that the Air Force is no longer prioritizing this mission. Fourth, the Air Force appears to have discounted the risks involved with their alternative network-based plan, specifically the time risk, the cost risk, and potential vulnerability of such a network to jamming or cyber attack. Finally, the Air Force is once again proposing to shrink the size of the airborne ISR fleet at the same time that demands continue to rise. This committee has rejected the Air Force's last two proposals to do the very same thing. I look forward to today's hearing and yield back.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's hearing after all subcommittee members have had an opportunity to ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. I also want to remind members that immediately following adjournment of this hearing, we will reconvene in Rayburn 2337 for a classified presentation by our witnesses. Without objection, each of the witnesses' prepared statements will be included in the hearing record. We'll begin with General Harris. General?
Thank you, Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Tsongas, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify again, and I'm glad our engagements continue in both frequency and qualitative content, as they are very beneficial to the Department of the Air Force. Today, there may be questions that lead to classified answers, to which we'll be happy to continue on our scheduled closed session rather than talk around a correct answer in this open session. The United States Air Force now operates several intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, capabilities across many domains. This hearing is focused on the air domain, and the witnesses you have invited appear to here are clearly experts that can speak to our joint requirements and operations, as well as our Air Force modernization plans. The National Defense Strategy, published in January of this year, highlights the importance of competing and winning at all levels of engagement, above and below the level of armed conflict. The same strategy also tells us to focus on the high-end side of the combat spectrum and gives us some areas to take risk. Most of these risk discussions will need to take place in our already scheduled closed session. To understand the situation and make decisions that keep the United States and our joint forces ahead of our adversaries, we must maintain a robust and survivable network of ISR systems that will ensure our competitive advantage. This means we must not only collect the information, but we must also process, exploit, and disseminate it. Additionally, we must protect the information and ensure that it's accurate, reliable, and of decision quality. This soup-to-nuts effort was the focus for the ISR portion of our FY19 budget. We appreciate the continued support of the Tactical Air Land Forces Subcommittee, and we look forward to your questions.
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Tsongas, and distinguished members of the Tactical Air Land Forces Subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you today to discuss the Air Force's fiscal year 2019 budget request for airborne intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance programs. In my capacity as the Director of Information Dominance Programs, I have the distinct pleasure of supporting the modernization activities the Air Force is accomplishing to put cutting-edge ISR capabilities in the hands of our warfighters. From the applications used for planning airborne campaigns resident within our air operations centers to the intelligence gathering and strike capabilities on the MQ-9 remotely piloted aircraft, the Air Force's ISR programs are critical to providing the combatant commanders with the capability needed to support and engage in combat, drug interdiction, and humanitarian operations across the globe. I hope our discussions today will provide the committee with a greater understanding of the direction of the Air Force is taking to modernize our ISR assets. Your support is paramount to ensuring the Air Force has the funding needed to keep our ISR portfolio viable and ahead of adversarial threats and enhancements. I thank you for taking the time to have these discussions and for your continued support of these critical capabilities.
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Songus, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the critical importance of airborne intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, as we face the reemergence of long-term strategic competition. One of the key capabilities that has supported U.S. military dominance for many years is the Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, also known as JSTARS. For the last several years, the Air Force has been working on an effort to recapitalize this platform. While the ability to collect ground-moving target indicator data and to conduct battle management, command and control remain key joint force requirements, changes in the threat mean JSTARS recap will be challenged to satisfy these requirements in a highly contested wartime environment. In December of last year, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council acknowledged the validity of the existing JSTARS recap requirements, but also recognized the evolving threats in contested environments as an imperative for change, requesting the Air Force return to the JROC by April next month, 2018, with options for providing these capabilities in both permissive and non-permissive environments. Turning to the broader ISR enterprise, we note that ISR demand continues to outstrip supply, but continued investment in additional capacity alone will not reverse this trend. Adaptation and innovation in the development and employment of ISR capabilities will be key to ensure we have the ability to collect the right information, connect the right dots, and to get the critical information to the right people in a timely fashion. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and more importantly, for your continued support for these vital programs which support the Department's enduring mission to provide combat-credible military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of our nation. Thank you.
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Songus, and distinguished members, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here to discuss the Chairman's Joint Chief of Staff's global integration efforts as we look to meet the increasing requirements against the nation's strategic competitors and violent extremist organizations. I look forward to the following discussion and any other questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. Obviously, you heard from both of our opening statements that there are significant issues and concerns by the committee. The subcommittee has heard dueling testimony on a number of systems, and this seems to be like one of them, where we're told we absolutely have to have a capability, and then we don't need to have the capability anymore. We need to switch to a different capability, which is not yet completed or defined. That leaves us with not a whole lot of confidence in transitioning to the next stage. The Secretary of the Air Force is very eloquent when she talks of, her initial time here in Washington, where she was at the National Security Council, and she'd grab a taxi to go around town. And now she has an iPhone, and as Secretary of the Air Force has the technology of Uber, and she wants to make certain that the Air Force has the ability to lean in for that technology. But as she and I have discussed, taxis are still on the road. So it's reaching that new technology without abandoning technology. If we all got rid of all taxis and just went to Uber, we wouldn't have the efficient transportation system we have in our urban areas. And certainly, when you look at the arguments to abandon JSTARS, you are left with that sense that perhaps the stretch for new technology isn't being correctly evaluated in the terms of what our true needs remain. Now, one concern that we stated in our opening was the Air Force's ABMS concept is not scheduled to achieve initial operational capability until 2035. Let's just pause for a moment on that number. 2035, initial operational capability, and full operational capability until 2042. How do you plan to mitigate BMC-2 risk for the joint warfighter on the ground if JSTARS recap is not fielded and ABMS does not reach full operational capacity until 24 years from now? When we all think back to the Secretary's analysis of technology and the analogy to the iPhone has only been with us for 11 years. And this isn't going to reach full operational capacity until 24 years from now, but yet we are going to lose capability if we don't pursue modernization, recapitalization of JSTARS at the same time that we reach for new technology. So General Dolan, explain that gap. Explain how we're going to be able to evaluate what this is going, the effect is going to be on the battlefield, and what we need to do in the upcoming NDA. Thank you.
Well, Chairman, I can tell you from the perspective of a requirement, we will always have a requirement to have multi-targeting indicator. There's going to be a requirement to be able to fuse information in order to have the capabilities that the JSTARS currently have. That I don't see any future wartime commitment that would change that in the upcoming years.
Okay, well, that was certainly validation of the concern. I don't know how the plan that we're being presented might be able to address that. Anyone else want to comment? General?
Mr. Chairman, from the perspective of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council and the Joint Staff, providing support to the warfighter is paramount in terms of marshaling the capabilities to support our missions around the world. There is a period here where we look at this evolving threat that caused the JROC to ask the Air Force to review the options available to perform the ground-moving target indicator and battle management command functions that JSTAR performs. And that work is forthcoming, some of which you'll hear about today. I think there's a period here, at least, and acknowledge your concern with the timeline into the future for the delivery of the full systems. There is, that I know the Air Force can describe in greater detail, an incremental approach that does allow for a degradation, a graceful degradation, if you will, in the numbers of JSTARS platforms available to our warfighters in the near years while ABMS is being developed. And there's work to be done for sure in developing ABMS, but there is a plan to mitigate that risk as ABMS is developed with both existing platforms as well as new capabilities that can be brought to bear.
General Harrison, Ms. Thornton, the JSTARS recap platform is being developed as a true open architecture, open mission systems platform. The same as what the Air Force is stating that it's trying to achieve for ABMS concepts. If Congress were to provide sufficient funding to continue the JSTARS recap program, could you integrate this system as the foundation for increment 1 of the ABMS concept?
Chairman, yes. Simple answer to that is we would be able to increment and bring it into increment 1 or 2. 2 is basically the time frame you're looking at by the time we'd have this developed.
Ms. Thornton, you want to comment?
Yes, I'll just add to that. We're able to do that from a technology standpoint. Certainly, again, it's available in the increment 2 time frame, not the increment 1 time frame.
Ms. August?
Thank you. I'd like to just visit the process that brought us to this place where, with this sort of abrupt change of direction. So as we know, 70 years ago, the Air Force conducted the analysis of alternatives to determine what capabilities a JSTARS replacement would need and what kinds of threats the aircraft would likely encounter. And since that time, the Air Force has invested hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars and countless staff hours from some of our brightest minds to build a next-generation JSTARS capability, an effort built around conclusions that were drawn in 2011. Now those conclusions have been re-examined, and Congress is being asked to cut our losses and pursue a different and technologically challenged alternative, with time risks, cost risks, and unknown cyber vulnerabilities. So my point is this: there has to be a process in place to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent as wisely and efficiently as possible, and that we in Congress can trust that process. So General Harris, my question is twofold. Did the Air Force simply get the 2011 AOA wrong? And if so, how can we go about correcting the AOA process in the future to make sure we are spending taxpayer dollars on the capabilities we need, and that it's a process that when it brings forth its decisions we in Congress can trust was done in a forward-looking way?
Yes, ma'am, that's a great question. I wouldn't say in 2011 we got the analysis of alternative studies wrong. We just looked at and underestimate the pace of change and the threats that come up. We talked through that AOA, multiple threats that exist today that were forecast to be here in 2024 and 2028. So that threat has accelerated quickly. And I think the committee here will recognize why that's happened based on some of the pictures we've shown in our past engagements from that. When it comes to us and the process, we do intend to move our acquisition process and our requirements process faster than what we've been doing, which will allow us to be able to get ahead of the technology piece. So the money that we invested in the JSTARS recap effort, those radars, the technologies we're pulling out of that, we think will still benefit us in increment 2 and increment 3 as we move forward. So it was not money wasted.
So what you're suggesting is that you didn't anticipate the pace of change or the pace of evolution among our near peers. And my question would be, there have to be people out there who could have been brought into this process who could have better assisted the Air Force in thinking further out, or a better understanding that who are in a world in which change comes much more quickly, who knew this had the potential to move rather quickly, more quickly than you were thinking about. And so how in the future do you be sure you're casting a wide net to get that kind of thinking at the table?
Okay, so we do have a new senior acquisition leader in our department who leans forward in that direction. And as we heard testimony from him yesterday in a different committee, he is committed to that process. So I think you'll see those changes coming up, and it's a change in the way we've done business in the past. We certainly don't intend to start down one direction and have abrupt changes, but we have a national defense strategy that's changed. In 2011, we weren't talking about peer threats. We didn't have a strategy that said you need to focus on the high end of the combat. We were focused on winning today's fight in a coin type of an environment where this airplane was well developed and deserved. So I would say that while we may not be keeping with the pace of change, we're trying to change that rather than continue to invest money in the old way of doing things, that 15 years from now we'll have the same capability in a JSTARS recap aircraft that we have today, but it'll only work in a small portion of the globe rather than our increment 3 that we're trying to get at to span the globe.
Question for you, General Irabardi. The original reason for the JSTARS aircraft was to enable Air Force and Army coordination for attacking targets deep behind enemy lines. That mission still seems very relevant in the context of possible conflicts with North Korea and Russia, where the U.S. Army and our allies will likely face large enemy ground forces. The Air Force's original AOA, certified by the Joint Staff, determined that Joint Battle Command with the U.S. Army on board the aircraft itself was still an important requirement. Is that no longer the case? And how will the Air Force integrate the ability to attack well behind enemy lines with the Army under the proposed JSTARS alternative?
Thank you, ma'am. The Army certainly should expect and the delivery of the capabilities required for it to operate in a wartime environment against a near peer or a peer competitor in a high-intensity action. That we expect will be delivered by the Air Force, by the Joint Force, the collection of assets that are available to provide commanders what they require. So the JSTARS, as it was envisioned to provide those capabilities in a contested environment, as we've described, that has changed, and indeed, we can say the intent would be to be able to deliver under ABMS an even greater level of support to warfighting commanders in contested environments than they might otherwise receive as we watch the threat evolve in places that, like as you've described.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is, I guess, General Harris and General Dolan. You know, our thirst for intel can never be quenched. And we currently cannot meet all the ISR requirements for all of our combatant commands, yet we're talking about lessening that capability. That just absolutely makes no sense to a dumb grunt. We certainly need to shift our reliance on relatively indefensible surveillance systems. As state competitors or peers like Russia and China, you know, challenge that. But we also, our bombers in World War II didn't have the capability of defending themselves on deep bombing missions. But we didn't discontinue bombers because they weren't survivable. We put fighters with them to make them more survivable. We have lots of things in the Army that are not survivable by themselves. but we place protection around them based on the criticality of that asset. So I'm very disappointed that we would even think about reducing our ISR capabilities without first fully replacing that when we already have a shortfall that is critical in all areas of the globe. And so, you know, we've gone through this with the U-2. We've gone through it with the A-10s for us ground guys with the Air Force, where they didn't want to use the A-10s because they're not survivable in air-to-air, and they're not. But at the end of the day, nothing's better for that grunt on the ground than an A-10 killing those tanks, because an F-16 doesn't do that, and the F-35 doesn't do that. They have different missions, but an A-10 is still critical to killing those tanks on the ground, which is what us Army guys care about. And so, how is the planned cancellation of JSTARS recap going to affect the ISR requirements of warfighters on the ground? And has the Air Force discussed this decision with the Army and Marine Corps? And if so, what do the Army and Marine Corps think about this? Not either General Harris or General Dolan, either one.
Sir, I'd be happy to start that, and if General Dolan has something to add, he's more than welcome to participate. So, sir, we have spoken with the Army and the Marine Corps, and we're also speaking with each one of the combatant commanders to make sure, and to this point, they have all agreed with our way ahead. Mostly because the fights we are most concerned about for our soldiers and our Marines that are on the ground are these highly contested fights in these areas where we may not have air superiority over the top of them on day one. The JSTARS recap does not do that for us. It would be pushed out of that same fight. You talk about adding fighters to our bombers in World War I and II to make them survivable. Completely agree, but a fighter with the JSTARS doesn't help when it's multiple SAMs coming out and there's nothing the fighter can do about it from that perspective, even if it's a 5th-gen fighter attacking other missiles that are long-range and exceed the radar capabilities of the JSTARS recap. It still doesn't change that situation. If there is a reduction, and right now we're under-promising and intend to over-deliver, I don't think it will be long in our ISR capability, and when we do complete Inc. 3, hopefully well before the time that is laid out in the plan now, and I think we'll see more of that in our closed session, you will see much more capacity to get after ISR across the globe in this GMTI type of a role, rather than in 2 or 3 narrow orbits and caps.
So we're not going to have a gap, and because I point this out. If they're targeting a JSTARS as opposed to some other asset, that shows the value of that JSTARS to our guys on the ground, that they would target, because we only go after high-value target. So the fact that they would take a JSTARS out of the sky as opposed to something else shows the value it has to the guys on the ground. And so I just want to make sure, and I want you guys, regardless, I don't care which system we go to. Here's what I do care, is that we never have a gap where we don't have the ability to get that ISR to the combatant commanders. And can y'all tell me that's what we're going to do if we do this? We're never going to lose capabilities that we currently have, whether contested or not contested.
No, sir. We are not making that promise. Even with today's fleet, there will be a gap. There's nothing we can do about it because of the way the threat has accelerated. If it requires us to have soldiers on the ground that are in this battle space, we will put airmen up there. Our approach to this is to put fewer airmen at risk so that we can get this mission done. We have multiple other sensors, some manned, some unmanned, that get after this. So we are intending to minimize the gap and make sure that when we're done, we actually provide a better capability in both contested and uncontested than where we're heading with the recap.
I understand, but when those airmen and airwomen are not at risk, those guys on the ground, those soldiers and Marines are at risk to prevent that risk to Air Force people. And we just can't accept the lack of ISR. And I hope you guys will really rethink this, because we really cannot accept a gap in our capabilities to conduct ISR until we have a replacement. We shouldn't chase shiny objects until we have one that works. And I just say we cannot afford at this critical stage, we still have coin fight going on, and we can't afford to just fight the peer fight. We have to fight them both. And Mr. Chairman, my time's out, but I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and our guests for being here today. I'd like to switch the conversation a little bit to the MQ-9. I represent Southern Nevada, and of course we're proud to have Creech Air Force Base that conducts those airborne ISR operations, well, actually Nellis and Creech in Nevada, fighting the global war on terrorism. So I know that the MQ-9 have been operating at surge capacity levels for over 15 years. Obviously not an end in sight, as we need intelligence more and better each and every day. Our current fleet is about is 268. I know you're asking for 29 more, putting us up to 297 MQ-9. So what I'd like to know is, what is the current status of the MQ-9 enterprise? What are your plans to normalize those operations in order to reduce us from surge operations to our steady state sustainable operation going forward?
Ma'am, I'd be happy to start with that. Thank you to the outstanding airmen that are supporting this mission, and while they may not be present over the battlefield, they're doing everything they can to have the effect they're looking for in our COIN environment. Our effort, as you know, this past week we've flown our last MQ-1 in combat from a sortie perspective. We are now to a fully 100% MQ-9 fleet, and that brings a better capability and capacity rather than being stuck with that MQ-1 and not ever transitioning to something that's new. So much like we're trying in the GMTI environment, there's a better way to do this. To help the airmen that have been at this surge capacity for 15 years and not getting the credit because they weren't seen as being present on the battlefield, we've started our CPIP effort to take care of those airmen that are deployed at home, that are working 6.5, 7 days a week in this combat environment and still have all the home things that are associated with that, with none of the benefits of returning to a country that's grateful for the work that they're doing. We're thankful to say that we've opened up and said we're going to have more locations, so some of them like to have an option other than just being in the desert there in Nevada. Very much happy to be there myself, but we've opened up Shaw as the next location for them to give them opportunities to move about and continue a normal Air Force career while they do this fantastic mission. We've also fully manned the MQ-9 RTU so that we're able to get more air crew out, and we're increasing the crew ratio so that these fine airmen get some time off. It's work hard for 2 months on this, then be able to take a month to train, and we haven't been able to do that in the past, and we're starting to make progress in that. So it's moving well for the MQ-9 fleet.
I really thank you for that, because as we go out there and talk to the airmen and women who are working there, it is stressful in its own way, even though they're not actually there, and I appreciate that. I have one more question. Actually, I'd like to talk a little bit about the termination of the software development and modernization contract that we had for Air Force Operations Centers, known as AOC 10.2. So what do you feel, Ms. Thornton, were the root causes of the failure of the program, and how can we develop software that we can utilize, be more agile and nimble and dynamic in the next environment?
Thank you, ma'am, for that question. The AOC 10.2 program, as you know, was canceled. There were schedule issues. There were challenges in trying to deliver a lot of capability all at once, rather than looking at it more incrementally and how we could make improvements rapidly to support our users in need. So we're now embarking on an AOC Pathfinder, which started in August of 2017. And with that Pathfinder, we're using modern software and hardware, using cloud capability, as well as taking advantage of the way the commercial world develops software. You know, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, they know how to do it well, and so we're taking advantage of what they've learned to be able to deliver quality software, very user-friendly, very quickly, and securely. So that program is going very well, the Pathfinder. By this time, we were expected to have delivered one capability, which was the critical capability for dynamic targeting, and in fact, we've delivered 4 capabilities to Al-Udeid. So that's been a great benefit to those users out there. They've sat side by side with the developers and given feedback. So as we continue this effort, we expect to expand it out, and it will allow us to actually sunset our current 10.1 Air Operations Center sooner than we would have under the old program. So we're seeing a lot of successes. We're taking lessons learned in a way that we can apply to other programs successfully. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you all for being here today. As a retired ISR guy and electronic warfare person, these are exciting conversations. So I know you got a challenge. Each COCOM is asking for more assets than we have in the total force, essentially. It's like having to deliver 10 gallons of water when you got 1 gallon of water with you. So I know it's a very big challenge. So I want to first start off by recognizing General Dolan and thanking the OSD and the Joint Staff team for the new organizational structure that we've put in for ISR. I understand the charter that General Mattis put out is very detailed, and we appreciate it. We think it's great work. In the last NDA, we put in multiple reports that we're requesting from the Joint Staff or OSD, and there's 4 of them that were due on 1 March that we're still waiting on. I just want to point them out so you can push it along if you would. We did ask for a joint force efficiency assessment for ISR. How much ISR do we really need? We'd like to get a better handle for what you think that is. Also for the Joint Staff, a implementation and strategy plan to establish common standards and management procedures for MTI exploitation so that we can take MTI and standardize all those platforms and the data that comes off. And one that I was working when I was in the Air Staff was the 5th generation sensor stuff. How do we get that data off the F-35 and other 5th generation, and how do we exploit it quickly back at the Air Operations Center so we can get it back to the warfighters? And the 4th one is getting the steady state requirements for the RPA lines for beyond line of sight wide area motion imagery. And Joe, don't just give you a chance. You may not know where those 4 are at, but.
Well, Congressman Bacon, first off, I want to thank you for your continued service. Your background, obviously, with the committee is very helpful. It's helpful for the enterprise. It's helpful for the department.
I like being an advocate.
And so I want to thank you for that. With regard to the reports, we will definitely get back.
Okay, thank you.
And in a timely manner to get back here with you on that. You touch on a lot of the innovation that the department's trying to take on, and as you know, when you take a look at the joint solution, we have to look beyond just platform. We have to look at a whole system solution. And I think you understand that as we put thought, energy, and resources to that, that's going to make us better down the road, because we will never meet 100% of the combatant commander's requirement.
Right.
So we have to be.
It's hard to meet one of them.
We have to put effort towards that, and I think that with very pointed and educated look at and questions for us to challenge the department is good, and it's going to help us stay focused.
Okay, thank you, General Dolan. Question for you, General Harris. I think the vision for MTI is laudable. You're aiming high, thinking big. It seems to me there's 2 key points that we have to give confidence to people on. Will the current Joint Stars be able to bridge that gap? I mean, it's struggling right now maintenance-wise. Can it cover that gap that you're looking for to go to this new, concept? And the second part is, I think we just want confidence that you'll get approval from the Joint Staff or JROC for the plan before you move beyond the recap or the new Joint Stars. Thank you.
Congressman, great questions. If you don't mind, I'll also come back to talk about that 5th to 4th project that you worked on, because we have some successes to report. Yes, sir, we are confident that the current JSTARS fleet, the E-8 fleet, will have the ability to cover this gap. We've got a decision point in FY23 that allows us to use that fleet longer if we find that Inc. 2 or Inc. 3 are late in delivering, and that could extend that fleet by a few years to cover those gaps. So we're comfortable that we'll be there and confident that we'll be able to work this process to include where we think we're headed with the JROC and their approach to it, because what we have brought forward recently, we are seeing positive responses in both CAPE and ATNL, now that it's broken up, the A&E and ANS organizations, and we think it won't be an issue getting this through the JROC process. Sir, to your 5th to 4th and that communication piece, that is part of this solution that we are looking at, of making sure that we have both the sensors available and the communication to port that back. And we just recently demoed in an exercise in Alaska and 2 months ago in Japan with real-world aircraft, as was in the exercise, but out in a combat operational scenario with F-35s to F-15Cs, and it's working now. So we're happy with that.
Good, because that's a great sensor capability that we can get back, hopefully to the AOC, to launch the next wave of aircraft before those F-35s ever come back. One last question. I understand that we have a really good system for real-time MTI tracking, but then when we have to go back and do forensics, quality of life studies, that there's a lot more challenges. Do we have a plan for that?
We do, sir. That's part of the process exploitation and dissemination that we're working through. Too much of what we collect right now in any ISR platform ends up on the floor and is never looked at again other than just the initial take, and we have to fix that. Part of that is our AI ML. So it's artificial intelligence and machine learning, getting that to do things that they are much faster at computer to computer than we are with the human in the loop. And as we continue to grow and evolve and invest in that, we expect that that is a technology that's not widely available now. It will be in the 2023 to 25 timeframe, well before it becomes a necessary part of this.
Thank you, panel. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. The MQ-9s are essential to the state of California's National Guard as it utilizes aircraft during natural disasters such as fires, floods, and search and rescue, as was the case recently in my district. Most recently, the MQ-9 was used to assist in the suppression of the Thomas Fire, which devastated my district. MQ-9 is a vital ISR capability that provides around-the-clock situational awareness for our combatant commanders, but they are also essential to our guards as it is a life-saving capability for our emergency responders and citizens. However, MQ-9s are not meant to fly as fast as larger aircraft. In order to more rapidly deploy the MQ-9s, a deployable kit capability has been identified, which would allow the kit to be packed in a larger aircraft. Has the Air Force or the Army looked at the feasibility of incorporating and funding a deployable MQ-9 launch and recover element kit?
Yes, sir, we are looking at that, and that is part of the study. The LRE that you speak about, it is a significant move, and we go out and do that. I'm not sure if the Army is looking at it from that perspective, because it's your Air Force that's flying the MQ-9s, but in similar platforms for them with their Gray Eagle. We are looking at it from that perspective, but right now, sir, our MQ-9s, minus a few that are available for elements in Title 32 status, and our guardsmen are awesome at bringing that to the table to help when we can here stateside. We just don't have the capacity right now in our ability to fly additional lines. So the LREs are in place. We are looking at different plans to move those LREs, but from a deployable kit, we will continue to study that, but it has not risen yet to the priority that it's something we must fund at this time.
Thank you. Lieutenant General, any?
On behalf of the Joint Staff, nothing else to add to General Harris's response, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I'd like to associate my comments with you, Chairman Turner, and also with Ranking Member Tsongas with the concerns about the proposal. And as I listened to the comments from the panel, we have an operational capability of the new ABMS system of 2042, if things go as planned. Is that correct? That's when, all right, 2042. And you plan to stand down all of the JSTARS by the end of 2025. That's a 17-year gap between the standing down of 100% of the fleet and the operational capabilities of the new system. I guess General Lorardi, what are you going to do during that 17-year gap?
Sir, the notion of the advanced battle management system is the integration of sensors and capabilities, yes, to be able to deliver information to warfighters faster. Yes, so that is the intent of the ABMS, and at the appropriate time in the near future.
If I may,
yes, sir.
We intend to be there. Operational capabilities 2042. Is that correct?
For the final operating capability, yes, sir.
2035 for first operational capability.
Yes, sir. And
2042 for a good capacity, if you will. But 2035 is the initial operation. Yeah. If everything goes as planned, 2035, but the JSTARS are going to stand down, the intent is to stand them all down by 2025. You've got a 10-year gap where you have nothing.
Sir, I believe that the incremental approach that the Air Force is taking will yield capabilities along the way. That's the plan. The JROC will have an opportunity to review that plan in the near future.
What platform do they intend to use to deliver that?
It's a number of platforms would be netted together to produce the outcome, sir.
So, Congressman, if I will, I'll say from when you talk about the gap, you talk about where we're at now and how are we going to cover down, if you will, between now and 2035. So JSTARS is, with respect to the moving target indicator, we've got from a joint force, we've got 5 platforms that crosses multi-services that'll come across from there.
If you did not need the new JSTARS, then why did you request $417 million for the JSTARS less than 12 months ago?
I'll yield to the Air Force on that question.
Sir, because we were still in the study and we didn't have a national defense strategy at the time that was directing us to focus elsewhere and put your highest priorities in that conventional flight. And, sir, to your question, the JSTARS stand down that we're talking about in that time frame is only 10% to 15% of our GMTI capability. We will still continue to provide that, as was mentioned, with the other platforms to include the Global Hawk Block 40 and the MQ-9 with its GMTI capability, in addition to assets that are in the other services. So it's
and you will be pulling those. Are those assets currently being used?
Yes, sir, they are. And
so, which fights do you intend to stop using them in?
We will use them less in our low-intensity counterinsurgency fights, and the intent now is we bring these forward into a higher combat level from the perspective of using them in contested environments if we must be there to support our teammates on the ground. It also brings the sensors that allow us to not only see the target and to pass that information and share it, but to take action on it from a combat perspective.
If you assume that you're going to have to maintain the JSTARS to fill the capacity until the operational capacity is there for the new Advanced Battle Management System, and I'm not opposed to the development of the new Advanced Battle Management System. I want you to understand that. What is the difference in the cost of the recapitalization versus the maintenance of the current JSTARS fleet?
Sir, the recapitalization bill is about $6.5 billion for the new system to bring in the JSTARS recap program. And are you asking then to keep the cost difference for the current fleet of E-8s?
My point is that the cost of the recapitalization versus the cost of maintaining the existing JSTARS fleet, there's not that much difference in the two, but the capabilities are very different. And I would just, I do not understand the logic that the Air Force has used with regard to this decision. I think that y'all have made a decision and you're trying to back into it. I again want to associate myself with the comments of both Mr. Turner and Ms. Songas. I do not understand how the Air Force could have requested almost $500 million in about 12 months ago for the JSTARS recapitalization program and then turned around and said, we don't need it, so we just wasted that $500 million. With that said, I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Gallego. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's switch topics a little. Some of the materials that were handed to us right before this in regards to the U-2, and surprisingly, but good to hear that the U-2 with proper updates can last 50 more years, and be effective, or maybe even longer. So can we, as part of our fleet, can we just have a little more details on what kind of investments are needed to ensure the health of the U-2 program? And we'll start left to right if that works. Lieutenant General, would you like, Ms. Thornton, would you like to take this?
Yes, I'll
Thank
take it. So we are investing in working through diminishing manufacturing sources. Many of the sensors they're diminishing resources for that. We're looking at our ejection seats and how we want to modernize them and make them safer. So we continue to do that. We're also, as you know, the U-2s are pretty much rebuilt every 7 years. So right now they have a life out to 2055, but we're also investing in a structural study to look at taking that out to the full 75,000 hour life, which would take them out to 2100. So pretty far out there. So again, we, as a part of the next generation ISR dominance flight plan, there'll be a high altitude annex that will describe in a little more detail. We expect to deliver that this spring. All of the different capabilities that will be looking at for U2 and the whole high altitude fleet and incorporating those capabilities. But we are continuing to modernize the U2 and expect that to continue to be a valuable asset to the Air Force for some time to come.
Excellent. Yes.
Yes, sir. The NDAA that we have from FY17 tells us that we can't do anything to retire the U-2 until we have shown that Global Hawk Block 40 will reach parity with it. So we're also making similar investments in the Global Hawk Block 40, I'm sorry, Block 30, to get after this effort. So we are continuing to move and provide additional capability and capacity from what the original plans were to retire the U-2, but that's our expectation at this time. From an air perspective, nothing provides the altitude associated with the U-2 operations. The Global Hawk can see targets for a longer period of time, so each one of these platforms brings their different strengths, and we'll continue to fund both while we can.
Excellent.
The only thing I'd add is that the U-2 is a part of an important set of capabilities that we'll employ, and I don't have anything else to add to their responses. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Congressman, I'll tell you, from someone who has to fill requirements, it's the capability of what the platform brings, in this case with the U-2, with the capability it brings right now, until there's another capability that's brought up to the Air Force identified. We're going to actively employ the U-2 to its fullest right now in all theaters. And you can see now that it is across the world. We're going to continue to employ it.
From some of the briefings I've had, it's a great platform that really has served this country well. Thank you. Now yield back.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony here today and for your service to the nation. Thank you. I know that we touched on this processing question. Mr. Bacon raised this, but I'm going to dive into a little deeper. Although we know we don't have enough ISR platforms to meet combatant commander requirements, we still do collect enormous amounts of data, all of which take time to analyze. So processing, exploitation, and dissemination capacity is the primary limiting factor, as I see it, that we face in terms of making this massive amount of data actually useful. So how do we more fully use artificial intelligence and machine learning to more quickly sift through the data? And how will that allow you to more strategically allocate the limited analyst manpower that you have? And what types of gains do you see possible with increased use of machine learning? And then finally, do you think that we'll eventually see a reduced need for ISR, given that machine learning will better focus our collection efforts?
Thank you, sir. Great questions, and that is one of the areas where we see some of our most promising efforts getting after artificial intelligence to help reduce the manpower burden associated right now with the process, exploitation, dissemination of our intel. As we said, it is less than 20% of what we collect actually gets significant analyst time to help us come back with that. So we are working with several groups within our DCGS enterprise, our Distributed Common Ground System enterprise, to make sure that they are tagging the data that they see that we can then turn back and run through algorithms within the machines to help them learn, so they can come back later and tell us that's a vehicle with wheels, that's a vehicle with a track. This is to help us with those important parts. What we really think is that as we move forward, we can have the machines coming back telling us, look here for an analyst, look here for an analyst, rather than trying to scan the entire time of FMV, and we think we'll see significant improvements in that. And again, these are fantastic airmen that are working, so I don't think we will do away with ISR. It's how we get that ISR. In the 50s, we collected the same amount of ISR that's exquisite that we do today, but it was probably half of what was available at the time. Now, in today's information age, collecting about that same amount of exquisite ISR, it's only 1% of what's actually available across the spectrum. So we're actually trying to open up and use publicly available information to help us gather the information that we need as a nation to keep the lead in the technology advances that we have.
Congressman, I'll just add that it's just not a service-centric project that General Harris is talking about. It's actually a department-wide initiative to look at it, because we have to use automation and intelligence, artificial intelligence, in order to go through big data. The department has actually formulate a plan to go forward with that. And not only does it cut back on PED that you described, but it's also going to cut back on the manpower and the crews that you need to do that. So there's a huge manpower piece, not only from an man-hours perspective, but trained specialists and linguists that you can save in also doing that. And so it's a very important initiative across the department.
Thank you.
Sir, may I add to that too? In the DCGS program, we've been similar to our Air Operations Center. We've been moving to an open architecture. We've done 3 pilots to date, and in our FY19 request, you'll see about a 289 additional funds requested to implement that architecture across all 27 of our DCGS sites. And what that does for us is then allow some of these applications and capabilities that General Harris and General Dolan talked about, because we've got the right commercial hardware, software baseline to work from to allow for that machine learning and artificial intelligence to be developed in that pet enterprise.
Thank you all for that. So most of the ISR that we're flying right now are in areas where we maintain air dominance. Would our current mix of ISR meet the capability requirements if we needed to fight in contested environments? And how are we hardening our systems to make sure that they're protected against cyber or electronic warfare attacks by sophisticated threats?
Congressman, I'll start off from a requirement standpoint. The answer is no. And that's a priority that the department's looking at, and I'll yield to my colleagues to give more detail.
I would only briefly add, sir, that is one of the main reasons why, in fact, with JSTARS, we feel like we've got to review the recap program to ensure that we're able to operate in those high-intensity environments that you described.
Thank you, sir. And we are working through both the cyber protection, but also the physical defenses that are coming up, which is why we think we need to expand beyond the air domain for our ISR and increase our capability and capacity in all domains.
Thank you. I know my time's expired. I have additional questions that I'll submit for the record, but thank you for the answers. Thank you again for your service to the country. I yield back.
Thank you all for your testimony. This subcommittee will now reconvene in Rayburn 2337 for a classified presentation by our witnesses. Also, we have votes that are to occur at like 3:25. To the extent that people might be able to rapidly move to 2337, I'd appreciate it.